Towards the tail end of the 1920s, a worldwide depression hit countries with market economies. While the Great Depression was mild in some countries, it severely hit many others, particularly the United States, where 26% of all workers and 37% of all non-farm workers were unemployed at the height of the crisis in 1933. Many lost their farms and homes, and several people perished from hunger. All the while, itinerant squatters sneaked aboard nationwide freight trains. But how did we get here? Well, let's take a flashback to where it all began in the first place. Throughout the 1920s, the U.S. economy expanded rapidly, and the nation's total wealth more than doubled. The stock market, centered at the New York Stock Exchange on Wall Street in New York City, was the scene of reckless speculation, where everyone from millionaire tycoons to cooks and janitors poured their savings into stocks. As a result, the stock market underwent rapid expansion, reaching its peak in August 1929. However, as consumer spending slowed and unsold goods began to pile up, which in turn slowed factory production, the American economy entered a mild recession during the summer of 1929. Still, the stock prices continued to rise, and by the fall of that year had reached stratospheric levels that could not be justified by expected future earnings. On October 24, 1929, as nervous investors began selling overpriced shares en masse, the stock market crash that some had feared happened at last. A record 12.9 million shares were traded that day, known as Black Thursday. 5 days later, on October 29 or Black Tuesday, some 16 million shares were traded after another wave of panic swept Wall Street. Millions of shares ended up worthless, and those investors who had bought stocks with borrowed money were wiped out completely. As consumer confidence vanished in the wake of the stock market crash, the downturn in spending and investment led factories and other businesses to slow down production and begin firing their workers. For those who were lucky enough to remain employed, wages fell and buying power decreased. Many Americans forced to buy on credit fell into debt, and the number of foreclosures and repossessions climbed steadily. The global adherence to the gold standard, which joined countries around the world in fixed currency exchange, helped spread economic woes from the United States throughout the world, especially in Europe. Despite assurances from President Herbert Hoover and other leaders that the crisis would run its course, matters continued to get worse over the next 3 years. Ultimately, by 1930, 4 million Americans looking for work could not find it, and that number had further risen to 6 million in 1931. Meanwhile, the country's industrial production had also dropped by half. Breadlines, soup kitchens, and rising numbers of homeless people became more and more common in America's towns and cities. Farmers couldn't afford to harvest their crops and were forced to leave them rotting in the fields while people elsewhere starved. In 1930, severe droughts in the southern plains brought high winds and dust from Texas to Nebraska, killing people, livestock, and crops. This grim dust bowl inspired a mass migration of people from farmland to cities in search of work. In the fall of 1930, the first of 4 waves of banking panics began, as large numbers of investors lost confidence in the solvency of their banks and demanded deposits in cash, forcing banks to liquidate loans in order to supplement their insufficient cash reserves on hand. Bank runs swept the United States again in the spring and fall of 1931 and the fall of 1932, and by early 1933 thousands of banks had closed their doors. In the face of this dire situation, Hoover's administration tried supporting failing banks and other institutions with government loans. The simple idea being that the banks in turn would loan to businesses, which would be able to hire back their employees. In 1932, however, with the country mired in the depths of the Great Depression and some 15 million people unemployed, Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt won an overwhelming victory in the presidential election. By Inauguration Day, March 4, 1933, every U.S. state had ordered all remaining banks to close at the end of the 4th wave of banking panics, and the U.S. Treasury didn't have enough cash to pay all government workers. Nonetheless, the president, projecting rather calm energy and optimism, took immediate action to address the country's economic woes, first announcing a 4-day bank holiday, during which all banks would close so that Congress could pass reform legislation and reopen those banks determined to be sound. It also began addressing the public directly over the radio in a series of talks, and these so-called fireside chats went a long way toward restoring public confidence. During Roosevelt's first 100 days in office, his administration passed legislation that aimed to stabilize industrial and agricultural production, create jobs, and stimulate recovery. In addition, Roosevelt sought to reform the financial system, creating the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to protect depositors' accounts and the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate the stock market and prevent abuses of the kind that led to the 1929 crash. Among the programs and institutions of the New Deal that aided in recovery from the Great Depression was the Tennessee Valley Authority, which built dams and hydroelectric projects to control flooding and provide electric power to the impoverished Tennessee Valley region, and the Works Progress Administration, a permanent jobs program that employed 8.5 million people from 1935 to 1943. After showing early signs of recovery beginning in the spring of 1933, the economy continued to improve throughout the next 3 years, during which real GDP, after being adjusted for inflation, grew at an average rate of 9% per year. Unfortunately, however, a sharp recession hit in 1937, caused in part by the Federal Reserve's decision to increase its requirements for money in reserve. Though the economy began improving again in 1938, this second severe contraction reversed many of the gains in production and employment, and prolonged the effects of the Great Depression through the end of the decade. But the U.S. was not the only country facing the music. Depression-era hardships fueled the rise of extremist political movements in various European countries as well, most notably that of Adolf Hitler's Nazi regime in Germany, which led a war to break out in 1939. 1/5 of all Americans receiving federal relief during the Great Depression were black, most in the rural South. But farm and domestic work, two major sectors in which black workers were employed, were not included in the 1935 Social Security Act, meaning there was no safety net in times of uncertainty. Rather than fire domestic help, private employers could simply pay them less without legal repercussions. And those relief programs for which African Americans were eligible on paper were rife with discrimination in practice. Despite these obstacles, Roosevelt's Black Cabinet, led by Miriam Claude Bethune, ensured nearly every New Deal agency had a black advisor. The number of African Americans working in government tripled. With Roosevelt's decision to support Britain and France in the struggle against Germany and the other Axis powers, defense manufacturing geared up, producing more and more private sector jobs. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 led to America's entry into World War II, and the nation's factories went back into full production mode. This expanding industrial production, as well as widespread conscription beginning in 1942, reduced the unemployment rate to below its pre-Depression level. The Great Depression had ended at last, and the United States turned its attention to the global conflict of World War II. Did the Great Depression leave any long-lasting effects in its wake? Tell us in the comments below. This brings us to the end of this video. If you liked the video, please consider subscribing and sharing so we can keep bringing more content like this. See you next time.